And now it's my great privilege to introduce Fred Rosenbaum.
Thank you, Reva. And I really want to thank you and the committee, Millie and Claire, who are helping with the tech aspect of this, for giving me another opportunity, another season to discuss these films. It's really something I find so rewarding, and I appreciate this. Now, the subject of Auschwitz and the other death camps, it's unlike any other subject in Jewish or even general history. It stands alone, even within Holocaust studies. The reason is that the crime is of such a magnitude and the method not only unprecedented, but previously unimaginable, that it cannot be truly conveyed in literature, art, film, or any medium. As you all know, millions of people were treated as if they were poisonous snakes or disease-causing bacilli and exterminated in a systematic, assembly-like manner. In Auschwitz alone, over 1 million Jews were killed, as well as about 100,000 others, such as the Roma, called the Gypsies at that time, Poles, political prisoners, Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexuals, Soviet POWs. I've written about Auschwitz only once, a chapter entitled The Limit of Human Endurance in the memoir of Eva Levitsky that Reva just showed you. And it was the most daunting task I've ever had as an author. What vocabulary do you use? Can you write adjectives like horrific, terrifying? I mean, you can write that to describe a car accident. Do those words adequately describe that place, Auschwitz, the Auschwitz universe, as one writer has called it? It's almost like we need another tongue, a kind of language of atrocity to tell of it. And the Slovak film director, Peter Bebjak, is clearly aware of the immense challenges of depicting life in the camp. And he uses creative cinematic techniques to show us this alternate universe. In some shots, he represents a world that is literally turned upside down. The viewer knows the men are lying down and looking up, but still it's an indication of dystopia, of unreality. One Auschwitz memoir is entitled, Here There Is No Why. A few sequences of the film take place in a darkened room where naked corpses are stacked up like lumber. In fact, the SS called the bodies Stücke, meaning pieces. And the characters in that scene, they go about their business as if they see this sort of thing every day. So, with the caveat that the Auschwitz experience can never be fully captured, I would say that among the representations on film that I have seen, this is one of the most powerful. It was not shot on location, but the cast and crew visited the camp numerous times. They studied the memoirs of survivors. They studied the secondary literature. The main character told an interviewer that he lost 35 pounds in order to play his role. And the movie is highly informative. The true story of two Slovak Jewish prisoners who miraculously escaped Auschwitz in April 1944 and told the world for the first time, indeed proved to the world, that it functioned as a factory of death, gassing 10,000 people a day. The two escapees had meticulously documented this worst crime in human history while it was unfolding. Now, their revelations did not have the effect they expected. The Allies did not bomb Auschwitz or the railway tracks leading to it. The large majority of Hungarian Jewry, still alive at the time of their escape, was not warned. Nevertheless, their 33-page report, filled with statistics and diagrams, did contribute in a way they could not have anticipated to the saving of perhaps 200,000 Jewish lives. Now, their extraordinary escape and how their account was received adds much to our understanding of the Shoah. And yet, few historians have thoroughly examined this episode. So this is the opposite of the movie I spoke about in the spring, Holy Silence, perhaps you recall, on the hidden encyclical of Pope Pius XI. Remember, I held that the filmmaker had made too much of that document, the encyclical, in order to give a new twist to the silence of the papacy during the Holocaust. The Auschwitz report, on the other hand, while it brings to light another seldom told account, in fact, in this case, it had momentous consequences. Now, this is very much a Jewish story, and that's one element largely missed by the Slovak director and screenwriter. Except for one of the protagonists wearing a Star of David when he's registered in Auschwitz, and the word Jews shouted once with contempt by an SS officer, the film does not touch the Jewish identity of the two young inmates, nor their absolute dedication to the Jewish people, nor the Jewish reaction to their revelations. So I will discuss these key parts tonight. Now, they are trying to save the 825,000 Jews of Hungary from extermination. This huge, vibrant Jewish community, which included many ultra-Orthodox and Hasidic sects, had been spared deportation all the way until the spring of 1944. Let us look at the map of Hungary at that time. Can we have image number 1, please, Claire? Now, here you see Hungary, and the green part is Hungary before World War II and the borders of Hungary today. How did it have 825,000 people? Because it was a Nazi ally during World War II, and Hitler rewarded them by greatly expanding their territory. He awarded them all these territories. Now, after the war, you see where these territories went back to the countries they went back to. They all went back, and Hungary reverted to the small Hungary of pre-World War II. But look at how much they gained by being an ally of Hitler and why this was such a big country. Look at the part of Romania that they took that now became Hungary. So this is how there are let's go back to that, thank you. This is how there is this huge population of Jews in this country. But because it's an ally of the Nazis, they're not deported to Auschwitz yet. Now, their ruler was a Nazi puppet named Admiral Horthy. He severely discriminated against the Jews, as we'd expect, but he resisted sending them out of the country. By the way, some Jews from other countries actually went into this larger Hungary just as a haven, as a refuge. But by March 1944, with Germany's defeat clearly on the horizon, the Nazis feared that, like Italy the year before, Hungary would sign its own armistice with the Allies and switch sides. So in March 44, the Wehrmacht invaded and occupied this whole vast country. Okay, you can remove that slide now, thank you. Now, they left Horthy in power, but his role was greatly diminished. And the SS, with the help of the savage Hungarian militia, the Arrow Cross, they now began deporting Jews. First, from the very large Hungarian countryside. Under the direction of Adolf Eichmann, they worked feverishly. For murdering the Jews was a paramount war aim for the Nazis. They could accomplish this even if they lost the war. That is, lose the war, but win the genocide. This phase of the Holocaust, spring 1944, is known by scholars as frenzied killing. With astounding speed, the Nazis would transport 450,000 Hungarian Jews to Auschwitz just within 55 days in May and June 44. The film shows that the mission of the two who escaped just before this deportation, they escaped in April 44. Their mission was to get the Allies and the neutral nations to intervene to stop the death factory. In reality, they also intended to send a loud and clear warning to the potential victims to hide or to fight back, and above all, not to get on those trains. Who were these two Jewish heroes? Can we see the next slide, please? Image number 2, Claire. Here you see them. I put their photos to the left of the actors who play them. They were Rudolf Verba and Alfred Wetzler. Both of them in Auschwitz for 2 years before they broke out. Now on the top, you see Wetzler, and he is the main character in this. Verba is more or less a little bit of a junior partner. In reality, they were equal in terms of conceiving this and carrying it out. The picture of Wetzler, I think, was taken fairly soon after the war. During the escape, he was 25 years old. And of course, there you see the actor playing him. Now, below, you have the very young Rudolf Verba. He was in Auschwitz from the age of 17 to 19 when he escaped. We're going to have a film clip later of Verba 20 years after the war. This photo, I think, was taken just before he was deported. Let's look at the next part of this screen. Can you scroll down? Both of them, Wetzler and Verba, published memoirs and here you see them. I read them both, and a good deal of the dialogue in the film comes verbatim from the memoirs, especially from Wetzler's memoirs. So this film is really quite authentic, quite faithful to the story of these two. As it turned out, after the war, Verba became much higher profile. He lived in Western Europe and in Vancouver. I'll talk more about him a little later. So he's actually a little bit better known, the younger one. But Wetzler's book is also, is just as informative. Okay, thank you. You can remove that slide now. Because of their linguistic skills, young Verba spoke 4 languages, including German and Russian, and other abilities. These two proved very useful to the SS. They served in many different capacities in their 2 years there. They were first in the Buna slave labor camp in the Auschwitz complex. Then they worked at a plentiful warehouse that stored food for the Germans. And later they worked the infamous ramp, where dazed victims descended from the cattle cars and were force marched up the incline to the selection station. And I think, as you know, they met a Nazi doctor, often the cold-blooded Josef Mengele, who would, with a flick of a wrist, determine who would live and who would die. About half who arrived were gassed to death within a couple of hours. Now, all of them had to leave their suitcases and backpacks in the train cars. And Verba and Wetzler's job was to remove the luggage and sort anything of value in a storehouse known as Canada, mentioned in the film, because the inmates believed the country of Canada to have unlimited goods and luxuries. But in this way, the two could, as they were sorting the luggage, they could find and secrete items that would help them in their escape later, such as boots, a compass, a watch. And most interesting to me, Verba found a map of the region in a school textbook that was in one of the suitcases. They took a long knife as well as a razor with which they could cut their wrists if caught. In the film, you see Verba fumbling with a straight razor when it looks like they're about to be discovered. Not least important, they found newspapers in the suitcases of the doomed that gave them a sense of the progress of the war, including the imminent German invasion and occupation of Hungary. Of course, from their vantage point, they could document the number of trains arriving, the number of people in each one. Part of their grisly task was also removing the bodies of those who had died on the harrowing journey. Verba estimates that he worked hundreds of transports. They were registrars toward the end. That's translated in the subtitles that you saw as scribes. Their job was to record the prison numbers of those who had died from the horrendous conditions. They were thus allowed to move freely, more freely than other prisoners throughout the camp. They had better food and they wore mostly civilian clothing. Neither of them was actually in the area of the gas chambers, but they learned the precise details from another Slovak Jew, Philip Müller, who was a Sonderkommando who carried the dead bodies into the crematoria for 2 years and who would survive and write his own harrowing memoir. In short, Verba and Wetzler knew the workings of Auschwitz better than anyone except for the SS itself. They also knew the exceedingly long odds against a successful breakout. Over 1.3 million people were sent to Auschwitz over 4.5 years. Although there had been hundreds of escape attempts, only one had succeeded before they tried. 2 others got away later, also with valuable information about the report, valuable information about the camp. So the total in the whole history of Auschwitz is only 5 escapes, 5 people who escaped. This is because the security was virtually impenetrable. In addition to SS guards with ferocious police dogs, the camp was ringed by an electrified fence, 5,000 volts and 13 feet high. Beyond that was a 6-yard wide moat, 15 feet deep. Tall watchtowers manned by machine gunners added to the surveillance. Bright searchlights illuminated the whole area at night. Even if a person somehow made it out of the camp, he would face not only a dragnet of German soldiers and anti-Semitic Polish and Slovak militias, but also locals who would often betray Jews for a reward. If still wearing a camp uniform of striped pajamas with a shaved head, the escapee would be a walking target. The many caught escaping were hanged in full view, as depicted in the opening shot of the film. The man, I think it's Wetzler imagining himself caught and executed, is gasping for breath because he's only 6 inches off the ground, death by strangulation, rather than a long drop from the gallows that results in a shorter, less agonizing end. Those caught were first tortured before they were hanged to get them to reveal how they escaped. That's why Verba and Wetzler resolved to slit their wrists rather than be taken alive. The 2 young men bet their lives on an escape plan that was ingenious. It's shown in the film, of course, but it's a little confusing, so let me try to explain their plan. Claire, if you can put up image number 3, please. This is a map of Auschwitz, the whole Auschwitz complex. By the way, when you arrive there as a visitor, you are just struck by the vast size and scale of this. It's about 20 square miles. Now, very tight security is done in 2 layers. Let me, though, first just say a few words about the complex. On the right, there's the IG Farben Buna factory. That's a slave labor, in effect, a slave labor factory. Then you have the town of Auschwitz, and a little beyond that, it says Auschwitz main camp. That's the administration. That's where they have the sign Arbeit macht frei, and those are big brick buildings that you've seen in film many times. But that's not where the extermination took place. It was in Birkenau, about 1.5 miles away. If you go to the upper left, you see Birkenau. That's it. That's where the gas chambers are and the crematoria. Now, notice that, well, you actually can't see, I have to explain this, that heavy security with the electrified fence, that is very, very close to the outline of Birkenau. It's very close to that. But there is an outer area. It says outer perimeter, which you see there. And that's not as tight security. So what they thought they could do is this. If a prisoner was reported missing from Birkenau, he or she would be hunted down in this outer perimeter. The idea was that the person somehow got through and was in the outer perimeter. But this was a major operation to search the outer perimeter because that's several square miles. And that search would be called off after 3 days. After that, it was assumed that the escapee was already in the countryside and would be pursued there. So here was the plan. Verba and Wetzler reckoned that if they could hide undetected for 3 days, somewhere between the inner and outer perimeter, and maybe Claire, you could show with the cursor where we think they were, somewhere in there. Then when that period was over, the 3 days, they would face a looser security system to get out of the camp entirely. The outer fence, that outer perimeter, was 4 miles in length and it was not electrified. It was just barbed wire. Now, how could they do that? How could they hide within this outer perimeter for 3 days? Well, their chance came because of a construction project to accommodate the anticipated massive influx of Hungarian Jews. A new ramp was being built for which hundreds of wooden planks were needed. A few sympathetic Polish prisoners fashioned a kind of bunker at the worksite, camouflaged with wood all around it and on top. Now, I said that even if it's within the outer perimeter, there's an intense search for 3 days. So how would they avoid being sniffed by the dogs? They covered the scent by dousing themselves with gasoline, which you see in the film being poured through the planks, and by spreading around a particular type of Russian tobacco. And it worked. Okay, you can remove that map of Auschwitz. Thank you. Remember, the film shows that when the time finally came to pull off the wooden roof of their makeshift bunker, the boards were too heavy to be moved. They were already weak and starving. That hiding place could have been their death chamber. But with tremendous effort, they were able to dislodge the planks and then crawled their way toward the outer fence, again, not electrified, and toward freedom. Luckily, pure luck is absolutely essential in all survivor stories. They meet righteous Gentiles on both sides of the Polish-Slovak border. They make it to the northern Slovakian town of Zelina. It's not that unusual In addition to the widespread Polish complicity in the Holocaust, that country had the most righteous Gentiles in Europe as well, over 6,000, many motivated by religious reasons. Now look at their escape route. Can we see the next slide, please? Here's how they did it. You see at the very top, Auschwitz, that's Auschwitz in Polish. See how they went down this mountainous region, very heavily forested mountainous region as shown in the film. And then they go all the way down and they finally reach the Slovak border. And even then, they just have very small towns there that aren't going to be very useful to them. They finally get to the small city of Zelina at the very end, the lower left. Now, that's where they met resistance leaders. They broke out of Auschwitz on April 10th. They don't get to Zelina until the 25th. So that's a 2-week, 80-mile journey across a cold mountainous region. Now these mountains, the Beskid Mountains, they're not as tall as the mountains just to the east, you know, the famous Polish Alps, but they're tall. They're about 5,000 to 6,000 feet high. And at that altitude, there's still some snow and it's cold and it's a very difficult journey, as you saw in the film. Verba did sustain a serious injury to his foot, although not quite as bad as that shown in the film. Not exaggerated at all is the sense of urgency they felt. They did not want to waste a day or even 1 hour. Again, you know, think of the calendar. They're anticipating that this mass deportation is just about to take place. Now, they were sure that the ignorance about Auschwitz accounted for the victims going so passively, the proverbial sheep to the slaughter. If there were knowledge of the gas chambers, they expected panic would break out and Jews, even the most religious who trusted in God, and there's so many of them on the Hungarian countryside, even they would hide or even fight back. And this is a point, the significance of this warning that they wanted to give. That's really not stressed enough in the film. It's, you know, that they wanted Auschwitz bombed. Certainly they did, but they wanted Hungarian Jewry to know what it meant to get on those trains. And I wanted to show you a film clip of Verba, Rudolf Verba, about 20 years after the war. And he describes this. He, by the way, he became very successful as a biochemist. He lived in London, in Prague, in Paris, and in Vancouver, Canada. Very cosmopolitan, as you'll see. And this video is very interesting. He is interviewed by Claude Lanzmann, the great French film director, who is filming Shoah, the famous Holocaust film in the 1980s, but he is conducting this interview in 1975, as we'll see, and the interview is in Central Park in New York City. Okay, let's see that film clip.
2 years which I spent in Auschwitz, and to escape only for my own sake would be ridiculous. And because I had the information in considerable detail that the Hungarian Jews are going to be murdered en masse, in a very short time. This means I expected that it should start in May, and it did start in May. And I thought I could see that the whole murder machinery could work only on one principle, that the people came to Auschwitz and didn't know where they are going and for what purpose. And I assumed that the natural instinct of self-preservation, if nothing else, will create, if nothing else, if not resistance, then at least sufficient panic that this organized transport of human beings into a center like Auschwitz, where they are being slaughtered like pigs, only less humanely, and with the efficiency of a major slaughterhouse, say in Chicago, that this process could be at least slowed down if those people would have been warned in advance and panicked. Because once there is a panic, you see, I thought if they, of course I hoped that there might be resistance, armed resistance, or any sort of resistance, because the Germans were so sure that no resistance is possible that they became cocky. I mean, it wasn't so difficult to hit back. And they would have been probably very surprised if there would be a resistance. But even if there wouldn't be a resistance, but only a panic, you see, it is a big difference to slaughter pigs or to hunt a deer. If you have to hunt each one separately, hunt him down, it never goes so fast like if you drive thousands, 10,000 or 50,000 pigs in a well-organized fashion and manner into a slaughterhouse. Once they are in the slaughterhouse, obviously, nothing can be done.
Okay, thank you, Claire. Okay, I want to stress the detail of this report. I mentioned it was 33 pages. It was replete with statistics and maps and even diagrams of the killing facility itself. As dramatically depicted in the film, they even had taken with them the label of a Zyklone B canister, the poison gas, a cyanide-based pesticide. Let me show you an example of the report, what it would look like if you received it, if you were reading it then. Can we see the slide 6, please? That's it. What they showed is above, you see a diagram of the actual gas chambers and crematoria. And this is a direct quote from their report. It holds 2,000 people. When everybody is inside, the heavy doors are closed. Then there is a short pause, presumably to allow the room temperature to rise to a certain level, after which SS men with gas masks climb on the roof, open the traps, and shake down a preparation in powder form out of tin cans, a cyanide mixture of some sort which turns into gas at a certain temperature. After 3 minutes, everyone in the chamber is dead. The chamber is then open, aired, and a special squad, Sonderkommando, carts the bodies on flat trucks to the furnace rooms where the burning takes place. Okay, thank you. You can remove that now. Now, the movie shows how the two young, ragged men were met with skepticism, even incredulity, first by the Slovakian resistance, and then the International Red Cross. I think the official played by the actor John Hannah does a very good job at reflecting that, and how limited there was the response of these organizations. But what devastated them the most, and this is not covered in the film, but is stressed in each of their memoirs, is the failure of the Jewish leadership, both in Slovakia and Hungary itself. In Slovakia, 2/3 of the Jewish population had already been deported, like Verba and Wetzler themselves back in 1942, and the overwhelming majority of them exterminated. But by 1944, the transports had long stopped, and the remnant of the Jewish community there, importantly its leaders, even amidst the persecution they were living in, were still under a false sense of security. They thought that deportations would never resume, and they would not be transported to Auschwitz. So that's Slovakia. Now, they translated the report and they sent it to the Jewish leadership in Hungary, and even arranged a meeting between Verba and Wetzler and the papal nuncio in Slovakia. But all of this took precious weeks, even months. The meeting with the papal nuncio, for example, at the end of June, took place after almost all the 500,000 Jews in rural Hungary had already been deported to Auschwitz and murdered. Verba and Wetzler's most vitriolic attacks are leveled against the Hungarian Jewish leadership in Budapest and its key functionary, Renzo Kastner. The two found out after the war that while Kastner had indeed received the report, this is top person in the Jewish Council, he didn't doubt its validity, but he betrayed his fellow Jews by negotiating a deal with Adolf Eichmann. Kastner was allowed to select over 1,600 people, including his friends, relatives, and colleagues in the Jewish bureaucracy, and others who simply bribed him to get on a protected train to Switzerland and also take along gold and diamonds. In exchange, and I know this is shocking, he kept secret the true purpose of Auschwitz. He did not warn his fellow Jews, even with the Verba-Wetzler report in hand. Now, to make matters even worse, he was a labor Zionist who made Aliyah and in the early 1950s attained a top post in Israel's Ministry of Commerce and Industry. When his wartime acts were revealed, it resulted in the greatest scandal in the early history of the Jewish state. A court ruled that the accusations against him were true, and he was removed from his position and publicly shamed. In 1957, Kastner was assassinated in Tel Aviv by the far-right Israeli militia known as the Stern Gang. Now, only 3 years later, Israeli agents kidnapped Adolf Eichmann in Buenos Aires. And they brought him, to, as you all know, to Israel to stand trial. The Verba-Wetzler report was submitted as evidence in the case, and the two were deposed by the prosecution. Covering the trial was the eminent political philosopher Hannah Arendt, whose book Eichmann in Jerusalem would be one of the most controversial works in all of Holocaust studies. She used the Kastner case and the suppression of the Verba-Wetzler report as the prime example of the corruption and collaboration of the Judenrat all across Europe. Those councils set up by the Nazis to do their bidding. Simply put, the Jewish leadership in Budapest could have issued the warning and didn't. Now, this appears to be a sellout of their people to save their own skins. But even this most flagrant of all Judenrat betrayals is perhaps not so simple as it appears. Perhaps Kastner and the other leaders thought the war was about to end and the deportations would not continue for that reason. Or Eichmann might have given them to believe that their special train to Switzerland would be the first of many. Or they may have thought that a warning would not have been heeded by the Orthodox Jews and the small shtetls on the countryside, that they were doomed in any case. So why not save the 1,600 Jews that Eichmann allowed out? It appears that Kastner was a coward and a traitor. Certainly appears that way to me. But I have no way of knowing his assessment of this catastrophic situation that he faced. Perhaps delusion and misjudgment played a role, along with blatant self-interest. I would like to see a serious historical examination of the whole episode. Now, some of the most thoughtful analysts of the Holocaust feel you shouldn't blame any Judenrat leader, given that the Nazis put them in this impossible position to begin with. I don't want to argue either side of this debate right now. I just want you to understand the moral dilemma and Verba and Wetzler's overpowering sense of having been betrayed. Now, what about their demand that Auschwitz and the railways leading to it be bombed, thus destroying this apparatus of annihilation? Obviously, this was not in the scope of the resistance or the Jewish community. They had to depend on military and diplomatic measures of foreign powers. Their report, which was translated into English and several other languages, was sent through Switzerland to the Allies and neutral countries. In Britain, the document was read by Churchill himself. In Washington, it was likely not read by Roosevelt, although he was informed of its contents. The report was presented in full to US Secretary of State Cordell Hull and Secretary of War Henry Stimson. As we all know, the camp was not bombed by the Allies, although oil refineries and munitions factories nearby were destroyed in the air raids. There are US Air Force aerial photographs that plainly show the Auschwitz barracks and the tall chimneys. These photos are on display in the permanent exhibit at Yad Vashem. So why was Auschwitz not bombed? Given that so many powerful decision makers had the Verba-Wetzler report in hand. John Pele, the head of the War Refugee Board, set up by FDR in early 1944, implored his government, US government, to take this humanitarian action and bomb Auschwitz. Well, many of the political leaders were open to bombing the camp, but they turned to the military leaders who strongly advised against it. Let's look at the calendar. By the time the report was circulated in the Allied capitals, it was the first week of June 1944, coinciding precisely with the most critical battle of the entire war for Britain and the US, D-Day. The general's argument that no military assets could be diverted carried a lot of weight. And bombing from the air 77 years ago was a far less precise operation than today. Even though the weather was clear that spring and the range of the bombers was sufficient, there was no guarantee that the explosives would actually destroy the gas chambers in the crematorium. Moreover, they could kill tens of thousands of prisoners. Some policymakers even argued that in such an event, the Germans would have an alibi after the war, claiming that the inmates of Auschwitz were killed not by the SS, but rather by Allied bombs. As for the railway tracks and bridges, it was argued by the high command that even if they could be taken out from the air, they would quickly be repaired and back in service. There were some disingenuous arguments as well, such as that of Assistant Secretary of War John McCloy, who stupidly claimed that if the Air Force bombed Auschwitz, the Nazis would take, in his words, vindictive action against the Jews. As if anything could be more vindictive than systematic genocide on an unprecedented scale. Almost all the arguments against bombing the camp ended with the statement that the best way to stop the liquidation of the Jews and others was for the Allies to win the war. Of course, in light of the Verba-Wetzler report, Auschwitz should have been bombed. The moral imperative of destroying or at least disrupting it should have eclipsed all other considerations, even the legitimate ones. But let us return to the calendar. Because of the delays in getting out the report and then the preparations that would have to be made for such a bombing mission, it could not have been launched until late June. By then it was too late. The overwhelming majority of nearly 500,000 Jews from the Hungarian countryside had already been gassed. I cannot stress enough the furious indignation felt not only by Verba and Wetzler, but also by almost all the victims as a result of not only America's, but the world's unresponsiveness to their plight. Elie Wiesel's classic novel, Night, based on his experience in Auschwitz and Buchenwald, was originally written in Yiddish with the title Und die Welt hat geschwiegen, and the world was silent. But did all this mean that the Verba-Wetzler escape and report was in vain? Not at all. I'd like to close on a positive note. Although they could not affect the destruction of the Jews in rural Hungary, their report contributed greatly to saving almost 200,000 Jews in Budapest and its environs. How did this happen? As mentioned earlier, Admiral Horthy was still in power even after the Germans invaded and occupied Hungary in March 44, but now a puppet with little agency. The SS, which had to rely on widespread Hungarian governmental and police support, swiftly and efficiently carried out the mass deportation to Auschwitz. Horthy, not a man of principle or courage, felt he had to go along with this project of mass murder of his citizens. At the same time, he was sure that Germany was going to lose the war. And having read the Verba-Wetzler report, he realized he personally would be held to account for his complicity. Because of the report, by late June, world leaders, although they didn't bomb the camp, world leaders, including Roosevelt, Churchill, the King of Sweden, and in guarded terms, even the Pope, implored Horthy to end the transports. On July 2nd, the American Air Force bombed Budapest, and Admiral Horthy thought incorrectly that this was an attempt to pressure him to end the deportations. That he did on July 8th. That is how Budapest Jewry was saved. Even today, there are about 150,000 Jews in greater Budapest area. by far the largest Jewish community in East Central Europe. Only one day after Horthy's momentous decision, the heroic Swedish diplomat Raoul Wallenberg arrived in Budapest and began issuing protective Swedish passports to the city's Jews, rented dozens of buildings to house them. Of course, that too contributed greatly to this extraordinary rescue. Now, unfortunately, the Verba-Wetzler report, consequential though it was, has been given scant attention by most leading Holocaust scholars. The reason for downplaying it may be due to the unwillingness of the historians to face the Jewish organization's failure to act upon receiving the Auschwitz report. There's a full-length book by the Israeli scholar Ruth Lynn just about this minimizing of Verba and Wetzler. So this film is especially welcome. Now, I'd like to conclude with one objection, though. The bigoted quotes at the end, you recall while the credits are rolling, there are quotes from contemporary populist authoritarian leaders like Bolsonaro of Brazil, Orban of Hungary, Le Pen of France, and even Trump. Now, I do agree that there are some striking parallels between today's nativism, scapegoating, demagoguery, and the rise of fascism in Europe in the early 1930s. But there are not parallels with the final solution of the early 1940s. I think you can see from everything I've said tonight that Auschwitz and the other Nazi death camps were unique in world history, something that not only never happened before, but was unthinkable before. Yet I agree with the grave judgment of the filmmaker that it could happen again, but not necessarily from a far-right anti-immigrant regime. It could emerge in a radical left-wing regime, in a fanatic religious regime, in militant dogmatic ethnic regimes in Africa, Asia, or elsewhere. In the end, we have to recognize that human beings, in the case of Auschwitz, often highly educated, cultured human beings, committed this unspeakable crime. I think of the title of Primo Levi's book on Auschwitz, If This Is a Man, which universalizes the perpetrators. People did this to other people. The only comfort is that Verba and Wetzler also reflect human nature. The irrepressible urge to inform the world of monstrous evil, whatever the price. Thank you.
Thank you, Fred, so much. It's a very powerful talk. And for those who have missed it, and if you're friends, they can still see it through the end of Sunday. So do tell them that Fred's talk is available. We have only 2 questions right now, but people still have time to type in the chat. Do you know if this film is shown in Germany today?
Well, I wouldn't be surprised. This was Slovakia's entry for the Academy Awards, you know, for Best Foreign Film. So it has gotten play. It's not a big budget film at all. That's why I give a lot of credit to these filmmakers. And they had to have many hundreds of extras. But I do think this film is playing, has played in, certainly in Central Europe. Yeah, there's a lot of interest in Germany about the Shoah, you know, absolutely.
Do you think the change in leadership in Germany will affect how Germans look back at the Holocaust and how they look forward towards the growing number of Jews who have gone to Berlin and other places?
Right, that's a very good question. And I'm closely following, the coalition talks after the election last month to replace Angela Merkel after 16 years in power. By the way, let me just put in my own advertisement here. I'm leading a study tour to Germany in May of 2022. So if anyone's interested, I hope you'll join. Now, the new government in Germany and what is it going to look like? It is not going to include the very far right, the AfD, the Alternative für Deutschland. These are, some of the people in that party are neo-Nazis, quite bluntly. Others are just so xenophobic. Thankfully, they got somewhat fewer votes than people expected. They still received about 12 or 13% of the vote nationally, which is still very, very disturbing, but they didn't make gains from the last election. I'm cautiously hopeful. One party that did very well is the Greens. And this is something that people don't think about when they look at the politics in Germany. Of course, people are very concerned about the rise of the far right. That AfD party that I just said got about 12, 13%. 4 or 5 years ago, they only got 2%, right? But there's also a big rise in the Greens. They have surged, and they have more votes than the far right. So there's going to be a coalition. What I would like to see is a coalition with the Social Democrats, who were in power for many years until Merkel dominated the scene. I call them center left. They're definitely a force for stability. They did much better than they've ever done in decades now, maybe because Merkel is not running against them. They got about 25%. What I'd like to see for stability, and especially in terms of Holocaust awareness and fighting anti-Semitism and all the things that any Jew would be concerned about regarding Germany. What I'd like to see is a coalition of the Social Democrats and the Greens. And there's another party that's, it's a little bit antithetical to the Greens because it's a party of big business, but maybe they can join as well and compromise. That would be, to my mind, a stable coalition. And even though there has been an upsurge in anti-Semitism in Germany in the last few years, as there has been across Europe and even in the United States, overall, I feel positive toward the measures the government is taking, to fight that. That's the big difference between Europe 2 generations ago. The government was the enemy. Now, at least the government is on our side, and I feel Germany is going to continue to be the most stable force in Europe.
A comment. The film minimizes the Jewish element of Auschwitz.
Yeah.
Why was this omitted?
Right, that's a very good question. And that's why I felt tonight I really wanted to fill that in, right? I think it may be just, it's a very much a local production. These are Slovak directors. They're not themselves so keyed into the Jewish questions that we're always thinking about, right? But I think there may be a different reason. Remember, I ended with this point of trying to think about the Holocaust in a universal way. Remember I ended by saying, the end, people did this to other people, and I think the director may have purposely left Verba and Wetzler a little undefined because their purpose was, to show how this goes way beyond just Germans and their allies killing Jews and others. So that might be a reason why the Slovak directors chose that.
If there aren't any other questions, I don't think there are. I want to thank Fred for a very, very important, valuable, and very moving presentation.